Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by Duncan Swan, author of MONSTRE Volume One. In this genre-blending sci-fi thriller, a catastrophic event at a research installation unleashes a slowly advancing worldwide apocalypse. A squad of Marines are sent on a desperate mission into the Cloud, a dark wave of devastation swallowing Europe, looking for answers where only monsters may remain. 89 days later, the Cloud has reached the United States, sending Americans into a spiral of madness. An aging lawman, a conflicted ex-con, and others search for hope of survival as society collapses, chasing rumors of an old nuclear bunker and running from certain death. We watch these narratives unfold in parallel in a story that weaves modern science, military action, dystopian dread, and visceral horror. MONSTRE Volume 1 is a Kickstarter crowdfunding success and is available at Amazon and Bookshop now. And Duncan, welcome to Fictitious.
Thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. I think that intro that you did was probably a better summary of my story than I've been able to come up with so far, so I might steal that.
Feel free. Certainly, I imagine that when you're writing something this massive, trying to figure out how to sum it up in a pithy couple of sentences is extraordinarily hard. One of the reasons I was really interested to get you on here is because, so MONSTRE is, like I mentioned at the top, is a Kickstarter-funded self-pub novel. You're the first person I've had on. I mean, obviously, Kickstarter and crowdfunding is really, really helpful in the creative world in general for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
But I think you're the first author I've had on the show who's actually kickstarted a novel. So before we even get into the nuts and bolts of just the writing of the book, I want to know why you chose that methodology, both self-pub and crowdfunding, and to just kind of get a sense of like how that's affected sort of marketing the book, getting it out there, how it helped get it in people's consciousness to begin with, because I think that's a really interesting avenue for it.
I mean, I have to thank / blame, that's kind of my joke at the moment, Hugh Howey for the self-pub inspiration. Because like this is rewinding 6 years ago or so now, maybe 7 or 8. When did Will's been out for 10 years? I think I discovered it a few years after. But basically, until I discovered Hugh Howey in his book Will, I hadn't really considered the writing that I was doing anything other than like a mental exercise. Because all the research that I'd done and the reading I'd done and the traditional authors that I'd read and their stories, it just sounded like a bit of an insurmountable barrier. And I mean, between getting discovered, ending up on the slush pile, getting processed through the slush pile, then perhaps signed, and then maybe published. The kind of story seemed like it would take years and years and years before you actually see a book on the shelves. And for what, as far as I could determine, essentially amounted to signing over 90% of your royalties at minimum or creative control. It just kind of seemed a little bit outdated, perhaps. And I also read somewhere, I think Brent Weeks dropped it in one of his Q&As, that it takes about 5 to 6 books in print before an author can kind of live off the royalties. And I just didn't really have that kind of time on hand, so I kind of was looking for a way to shortcut it or not do it at all. And then Hugh Howey came along and I went, okay, well, self-pub seems to be a viable option. You just have to obviously approach it differently. And so I kind of decided that once I decided that I was going to write and I had enough confidence in my ability, it kind of seemed like a no-brainer. And as for the Kickstarter and the crowdfunding part, for anybody who's tried to write a book or is in the process of writing a book, publishing is expensive. Printing is probably the most expensive part outside of editors and formatting and getting a cover designed. And also tied to part of that is getting your book out. Like publicity is a big component. You need people to be aware of your book. It's not like a field of dreams. If you write it, unless you tell people and a wide audience, not necessarily anybody's going to ever discover it. So I kind of viewed Kickstarter, once we're doing self-pub route and we knew kind of roughly how much it would cost to get X amount of books printed, as a great way to kind of diversify some of that cost and also at the same time create some kind of general awareness. I mean, if we could market it to a Kickstarter crowd who's already invested in finding creative outlets or supporting creative people, to give us a nice head start. So it did. It succeeded better than we had hoped. I think we aimed for 10 grand. We raised a little bit over 12, and we did that in 4 days, which kind of was crazy at the time. But it allowed us to print like 750 rather bespoke books that we've then used, and those we've used to basically obviously give to the backers, but then a large proportion as well has gone to reviewers and our publicity campaign. And we hired a publicist, Smith Publicity, and our publicist manager was Sarah Minearchi, and together we've basically tapped into their reviewers and sent the books off. So it's really kind of differentiated us, I think, from the standard indie book publisher who generally just hands out an EPUB or a Mobi file, and it made us look a little bit more professional than your average Joe. I think that's set us apart quite nicely. So it's fed back into the project more than we could have hoped.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that the printed volume is beautiful. It has these great like black edges on it. I'm sure you
got one right here.
Yeah, right there. Yeah, like I mean, you can't deny the power of just the physical copy, right? I mean, it's something, especially with books. I mean, I read in a variety of both in digital and physical, but physical is always my home in those spaces. And so when you get a beautifully designed book, it shows that the author is serious about what they're doing. It shows that, whether it's the publisher or the author themselves self-pubbing, that they've dedicated themselves to the craft. That's always one of those things where I feel like, you're not supposed to judge a book by a cover, but especially in this business, I mean, shelf appeal is a big deal, and so that's going to have a big impact on stuff. I like that you mentioned about Hugh Howey, and I in case people listening don't know this kind of story, Hugh Howey was a self-pubbed author for a number of years. Wool is his big breakout success that he actually wrote in installments that people were reading online. Started off as a short novel, or as a short story, then became a full novel that people were reading in pieces. Then it was self-pubbed. It became a big success with that. Eventually got picked up by a traditional publisher and has a whole trilogy, the Silo trilogy, which is excellent and disturbing and a really good way to mess you up, especially when you're thinking about pandemic days and stuff like that. Where you're we might be in silos faster than we realize. I mean, I think Kickstarter 2 is interesting from the standpoint as far as like finding an audience, because there's a way to reach out to new people. So you talked about getting a publicist and doing those things. How have you been working since the Kickstarter success in order to find new readers and then and branch out and kind of build on that big first push?
So the Kickstarter we ran in April. Yes, so we started it in April and we ended it on my birthday, and I think I kind of did that purposely. It's like either I get a great birthday present or I don't. And then the book was published in September. So between basically May and September, I was kind of waiting for the physical books to arrive. So that took a couple of months. And then after that was just disseminating them to all the backers, and then via publicity, kind of tapping into all the reviewers that they had on as part of their orbit. But then once we started, making contact and kind of having those conversations with those reviewers, via them, we then got introduced to other reviewers and their reader audience. And I was very much new to the reviewer, booktuber, bookstagrammar kind of clique that I guess you could call them. I didn't know they were really a thing until I published my first book. But because of that, I guess, community, it's because it's a close-knit community, and we've really resonated somewhat strongly with the horror community, which also took me by surprise. But because of that, like, I think they all start feeding into each other, and one tells the other, and then your word of mouth just travels digitally and a lot faster. So, I mean, I'm at the moment currently talking to a bunch of reviewers in the UK, just because we don't have a large presence there, and it's a little bit more expensive to send books. So it's more just logistically, how do I get a bunch across? And I mean, when we started this, I might touch on this later or before, whatever, but we had zero following, no social presence. I created a Twitter account just for basically for being an author, and then Instagram came after that. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Facebook, so I kind of tried to steer away from social media, and I've found over the last 6 months I've had to get back into social media. It's kind of just taken on a life of its own, and now it's more how do we keep growing that readership, and how do we keep growing followers. And even on Goodreads, we did a couple of Goodreads giveaways leading up to the release date, and that has a nice kind of multiplying effect in terms of getting on people's to read shelves and generating reviews. And I think that's kind of the biggest requirement of a book, is you need a broad spectrum of reviews on your website, not on your website, sorry, but on Goodreads and on Amazon. And that's generally what people look at. And I think they very much look at the tastemaker. So if a reviewer reviews books, granted, not many of them do it for a career, but a lot of them seem to do it for this crazy hobby. And people very much kind of trust their judgment, and kind of rely on that to steer them towards their next read. And funnily enough, since I got introduced to this crowd as well, I found multiple books that I would never have ever heard about. I would almost say a disservice to an author to skip that part. And that's really what we've been focusing on since June onwards until now. September got really heavy. And yeah, we're still tracking down new reviewers as we speak.
I like that you mentioned, I mean, one, we all know that like the social media is kind of a necessity in all this now, but something that I think that even when I started Fictitious in, I think, 2017, and had been doing another podcast called Nerd for a Living for a long time ahead of it. And I have been a rabid science fiction and fantasy and horror reader since I was a teenager. But I was not aware going in of book Twitter. I didn't know about bookstagrammers. I, only recently, even just jumping into YouTube, have become more cognizant of booktube, this really broad swath of it. And I've been on Goodreads for forever, but I really wasn't paying that much attention to just how hardcore that audience is and how invested in all these things they are. So I think
interconnected they all are as well. Like it's really funny. They all know each other, and like some of them, like they've got huge followings. Like I never would have imagined it. And for somebody who has no following base, finding those reviewers and finding reviewers that love your book is like the best thing you can really do for yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so personality based. I mean, I think when people go and, find somebody that they resonate with, I mean, there's certainly, I have a few authors and a few reviewers that are kind of my North Star. Whenever like I'm exploring new stuff and I find a new author, find a new book, something that I'm like, maybe I want to kind of vet a little bit ahead of time. There's some people that I go and I check first. And a lot of times I go to them because they have perspectives that are beyond what I do. I'm a cisgendered straight white guy, right? Like, so I have, and I'm middle-aged, right? So yeah, I've got a pretty specific view of the world. And so I like to be able to go and explore some different viewpoints so that I can get a sense of what I might be missing in a book, or what things that would hit me differently than a different audience would. So I think it's useful as an author to be able to examine those things, but also you can get really lost in all of it while just trying to do the act of reading, because that's the dangerous part.
No, yeah. I mean, as an author as well, I've learned things about my writing, and I was like, oh, I should have thought about that, or I hadn't looked at it that way, or yep, I'll be aware of that going forward. So those reviewers really point out the great parts about what you write, and they also point out about your weak points and the things that you might have missed. And so it's really important to pay attention to that, and because anybody who reads books really, and you know that reading is subjective. Mm-hmm. You and I might like entirely different books, even though we like sometimes read in the same genre. Like it's very much kind of an individual's taste that determines what they read. And but when you start getting reviews and multiple reviews touch on the same point, then it's not necessarily subjective. It's probably constructive critique that you need to take on board. So yeah, really invaluable group to pay attention to, and really great way to just discover new books. I mean, it's how I discovered Tasman Muir and Martha Wells, and I'm reading John Scalzi at the moment. Like a whole bunch of new authors I've discovered that have been out for a while and are new to me.
Well, you mentioned something in there too. You were talking about how like the horror audience found Monstre, and I should say like as people hear that, like this is the French pronunciation of that word, and that's the spelling in the title. As people
it's not a typo. That's
yeah. When I was reading this, I was struck by, to me it felt a little bit like Stephen King, The Stand. It felt a lot like Michael Crichton kinds of things. It felt like some of the sci-fi action thriller type things that I grew up with as a kid, and then and that I think is a little bit of a lost art. I mean, I think it exists in books, but I haven't seen. I guess because I'm so devoted to primarily science fiction and fantasy, that sometimes I miss the stuff that's a little bit more on the spec fic edge of things. Yeah. But one thing I thought was really interesting about how you were doing this, especially with the Kickstarter, is that you were soliciting artwork. You were kind of acting as sort of a creative director, like you would if you were working on a film. And in my previous career, I was a creative director, so this resonates with me.
Okay.
Yeah. So seeing how you were kind of like getting people doing comic style artwork, more like movie renders, 3D renders, kind of working on the monsters within the story, and the environments and stuff. So I thought that was really, really interesting, both as a promo piece and as a way of developing your own mind around it. So I want to know like how that fit alongside your creative process, and also how you used it in the marketing.
Funnily enough, it's not something that I started out intending to do. It's kind of something I stumbled upon when we started. I think I had written maybe a third of the book. I'm going to have to rewind this. And we started like looking at it. Well, how do we do this as a business? How do we look professional? We're going indie route. We've decided that. So what do I need to kind of to show that I'm doing this to the best of my ability, that it's professional. So it's a case of we started first with commission an artist to do a sketch of the monster. So at least in my mind, I knew what it looked like. It was consistent. I could play around with its physicality and just trying to differentiate it from all the other monsters running around. And then from that, we developed and got a cover done, which is there's an image that's basically hidden in the cover at the moment within the M. And that was the first art piece I had done. And we took that to a brand designer and basically said, we've got this art piece. We want to turn it into a cover. What do we go about doing that? Like, how do we make this professional? So we put together a brief in terms of determining like the title, the font used in the title, and the author tag, which is basically, how do we stylize my name, something that can carry across all the different books that I write. And from that, it kind of snowballed in terms of, and we've got a cover, we've got a book, we've got a brand. How do we market it? Like, how do you market a book? And that's kind of where I ran into a brick wall. You do hear great stories like Hugh Howey's one, where he kind of got organically discovered by a readership over a period of years where people liked what he was writing and he just kept doing it. And I kind of wanted to shortcut that route and say, well, look, no, you actually have to advertise a book. Like, how do you movies have posters and movie trailers, games, the same thing. Almost every medium out there that's creative has some kind of other way of displaying it to an audience and gathering interest, whereas a book is 500 pages of a dead tree. How do you make that interesting? Mm-hmm. So I kind of stole the idea of the art originally from the gaming world. And I think at the time, the first Destiny had just come out, and it come out with a whole bunch of really amazing concept art. And I kind of realized that that'd be a really nice thing that MONSTRE could leverage in terms of the visual aspect. I thought it would lend itself really well to some great visuals, especially with the scale that I was trying to develop and some of the, at least in my mind, the original concepts. And I was like, well, how do I display it in a few different mediums to kind of give it that cinematic look? So after the cover, one of the first artists that I worked with was a digital matte painter, which you probably know the background of these guys. If you look at most sci-fi CGI movies, there's the background mountains, whatever the large unmoving object is. It's generally a digital matte paint. Somebody's just photobashed a bunch of images together and made a new world. And we kind of started there with getting a few cinematic things, and then after that, I kind of realized, well, MONSTRE would also really leverage itself nicely in the comic book world. I came across a few Dark Horse comics at the moment. Dark Horse did an Alien run with an artist I'm a big fan of. Who hopefully I get to work with later next year. And so there's more case of how do we really kind of show MONSTRE in a few different lights and see which one works best. So I really started trying to find a few artists that could bring to life the visions that I had in my head and some of the key scenes from the book and put them in a format that'd be achievable. Some of the 3D renders, just because 3D renders are amazing, but it also works very well for physical objects. And then we did some of the more like graphic novel, comic book style for stuff that's almost impossible to do in a digital matte paint, really hard to do in 3D renders, but looks really nicely done in a stylized line art style. And then obviously a few more digital matte paint things, just because that's the closest that I could get to like a movie poster kind of feel that I wanted to kind of imbibe in MONSTRE. That became my way of marketing it. If you look at how books are generally marketed, people, especially on Twitter, I see a lot of this where they just spam the same link to their book account on Amazon, and it's the same book cover, and it's the same book blurb, and it's the same, their character limited tagline that they've got, and it's the same thing over and over. And after a while, your brain just stops seeing it. You switch off. It's not interesting anymore. It's not unique. And I really wanted to avoid falling into that trap. So generating the art was a good way for us to kind of, once again, differentiate ourselves and show that we were serious, but also, fire up people's imagination and have them think about MONSTRE as more than just a link to click on that they've already seen 20 times.
I really like that you brought that up because I think especially when you see indie authors, they do tend to, it's spamming it kind of is what it feels like when you're sort of hitting the same thing over and over again. Yep. A few of the publishers, I think especially in YA, have gotten cognizant of the fact that like they can use animated visuals and take the really cool book covers. Orbit as a publisher does this really well, where they'll do some of their sci-fi and fantasy covers with these these neat motion graphic things. Anything
the animated GIF thing almost, that's new.
Yeah. And it's nice to see that stuff because we do in a social media environment and the age of YouTube and all those things, we do need some more visual representation. And I also and this is a thing I've touched on a few times on the show, where I get frustrated by the fact that there's not enough physical collateral for books. And again, YA has been better about it. Clearly, things like Harry Potter and whatnot have leaned into that because of movies and things as well. But like, I'm always frustrated that there isn't basically movie style posters available with book covers, because so many book covers are so rad. I want to hang them on my wall, and they don't seem to exist anywhere.
No, well, I think part of that is people just haven't thought about doing it, and the other flip side of that is it is expensive. I mean, and this is one of my pet peeves with indie authors as well, is they tend to rush the product, and they tend to scrimp sometimes on editing, and a few tend to design their own book covers, and it looks a little less professional than it could perhaps. And as soon as you start reading a book that hasn't had an editor, and you stumble across 20 typos on the first page, people tend to stop reading. So it's all these things that they're expensive to do, but ultimately they really help your product. And the art stuff, I tabulated the cost I've spent on it at some point. It's not cheap, but the idea is, it's an investment, and it has differentiated us, and it's something that I hope to continue and will continue doing. And funnily enough, we had a few people, I've had 2 so far, who basically created some fan art based off the art that's already out there. So I had an artist called Stephen Oakley who did some of the original monster sketches, who works for Sony Santa Monica Games. But somebody did fan art based off his sketch and did a 3D render. And I was so blown away by it that I asked this guy to do an actual proper commissioned one. I was like, if you're this good at this, and I'll happily pay you to do more. So yeah, it's something that I wish I saw more of as well. And we probably will going forward. I think, fingers crossed, this is a nice success, then I can kind of be a case study for another way of trying it. And that kind of leads into, Hugh Howey, to keep bringing his name up, showed me that self-publishing is a viable option. I've just really tried to put my own spin on it and kind of make it new.
Well, you also mentioned, you mentioned that there's a video game aspect to in the comic stuff, as far as the the artwork and a little bit of the feel of the book in places where you could feel like this could be an RPG, this could be a video game, this could be that kinds of stuff. In this day and age, I feel like there are times where people give a side eye to anything that has an eye towards adaptability. But if you're looking for a long-term career as a writer and a creator, I think that having that in mind is necessary. I think examining that idea of where things could go long term. How much was that in your brain with all of this?
So to be honest, not a great deal at the beginning. At the beginning, I was more just writing, and then as I continued writing, the world kept growing. And then also, need is the wrong word. Wanted, obviously, Monstre to find success, so that for my own personal validation, but also so I can continue doing as a career. So adaptability, while not at the beginning, was a big thing. As I continued writing it and the nature of the story became apparent, I realized I was drawing how much inspiration I was drawing from the things that I love myself, being games and certain kind of movies, and Walking Dead, Alien, Generation, Kill, World War Z. All of those could easily be turned into a game in themselves, and in most parts have. And I'm not entirely sure why it is or what it is about that type of story that enables itself to be easily adapted to an RPG or a game or even a movie. So it kind of was an organic accident, where I just wrote about things that I liked, and those things generally are things that currently exist out there in terms of games. Like a good example is Metro Exodus, which is based on a bunch of novels by Dmitry, I'm going to mess up his name, Glukovsky. So yeah, it was a bunch of novels that he wrote, Russian novels that he wrote, and then they got picked up and turned into games by 4A Games, and that's that would be like the holy grail for us, really. It's an ideal. It doesn't very often happen, but I think Monstre, given the topics that I touch on, could go that route. A lot of people would say, oh, it's a sellout thing to do. I'm like, no, you're just kind of trying to diversify and really tap into as many possible markets as you can to sell your product, provided your product is good. So provided the writing's great and the story's great and people love the world, then I think other opportunities will present themselves, provided you've obviously marketed and people are aware of it. So yeah, originally it wasn't my intent, but as the art became a bigger component and as the story, especially the French side, which is far more sci-fi action-y than I'd say the US aspect is, became apparent that I was like, well, it's I have some Marines running around in exosuits and power armor. And I was like, well, this is like half the games out there, but it's kind of the only way you might viably fight an alien invasion. If you're going to go up against on foot, Your chances are somewhat slim. So I was actually a little bit terrified slash annoyed when Edge of Tomorrow came out. I think this was like 4 years ago. It's like, it's set in France. They're running around in power armor. There's aliens at the end of the world. I've been beaten to the punch in this point. So no, it's something that I've had at the back of my mind. Wasn't the prime directive, but it's something I was like, well, it'd be really nice to have. And that also, it's the same thing with the animated style art that I've had done. I was like, this could work really well as a stepping stone. Even if we do it in house as well, and I go find a studio that does those things, like a graphic novel or a few animated shorts in the style of like Cowboy Bebop or Dead Space or Wolf Brigade. And materials out there, and people obviously like it, and I like it, which is why I know these things. And I would like to emulate that kind of, I guess you could say, appeal or medium, and see if we can leverage it. So yeah, kind of a happy accident.
Well, I like that you mentioned Edge of Tomorrow in there. Some people might know it as Live, Die, Repeat.
Also based on a novel, which I've never read yet.
Yeah, I have actually. It's called All You Need Is Kill. It's a Japanese light novel, so it's essentially a novella. They call them light novels. It's interesting. That's one of those cases where you have a really strong novel, and the adaptation goes some very different directions from where the original novel does. It uses that same premise, but it veers a very different way, and they both work. I think that the original novel is definitely worth reading. The movie, unfortunately, didn't get marketed well, and not enough people saw it. But I think it's one of the better pieces of sci-fi that's come out over the last 10 years.
That's one of the most enjoyable movies that I've seen in the last 10 years. It was easily in my top 5. But which is funny because it's literally Groundhog Day, but with aliens.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's also you touch on the point, like, it diverged different from the book. I need to read the book, but same with World War Z. I mean, the book is very different to the movie.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes the case. I mean, a movie can't condense a full book or a full world sometimes into 2 hours. Like, you have to take liberties, or you at least set it in that world and then you go off on a tangent, which I think is a great thing. I mean, there's so many different stories you can tell in most books, and the author chose one particular story to follow, but it doesn't mean there aren't others that are worth exploring. And that's where like some fan fictions come in, and that's where movies tend to diverge as well. Like, you've created a world, and then let other creatives have a crack at seeing what they can do with it. I think it only strengthens what you've done.
Right. And I mean, and as long as what you've created in the first place stands on its own, there will always be an audience for that. There's a separate audience for films. I think a lot of people get frustrated when an adaptation gets made and it doesn't fit their idea of what it originally should be. And like, the original still exists. You can always still have that. You just get a new vision of it, which I think is very, very cool. There's something you remarked on earlier, and I want to get back and we can focus on Monstre.
Sure.
You were talking about how this story, it takes place in kind of 2 different time periods, and half of it's in France and in Europe, and the other half is in the United States. I want to talk about what drew you to writing in, a sci-fi story in a real world setting, whether you would call it current or near future, and basically kind of get a sense of what were the advantages of working with that, what were the challenges of working with that, and then we can kind of talk about that multiple time frame, because I think that's an interesting structure in it. But first off, just what drew you to writing in the now for this kind of story?
Okay. The first book that I wrote, which is sitting in a junk folder somewhere, was set in like the far future, 500 years, 1,000 years, set on Earth, but basically it was set in a world of pure and utter darkness, where what was left of mankind is living in these walled cities, protected by things outside. And this was the first book that I took, the first and only book that I took to my writing group that I had joined at the time, and it kind of got pulled to shreds. And I realized that it was a little bit too hard sci-fi, where it's kind of verging on magic and a little over-ambitious. So I kind of hit pause on that project and went back to the drawing board and tried to work out, it'd probably be more interesting to write about how the world got that way. And that was kind of the most common question I was getting from my writing group, is like, nice idea, but how? So I had an effect and I needed a cause. So working backwards, I was like, well, how do you turn the whole world dark? And then I started looking for like a semi-practical explanations for where this cloud that would, I needed a physical object to block out the sun. So I created the cloud to do so. And I was like, well, where does a cloud come from? And I kind of determined, well, it has to come from somewhere else. And then how do you get to somewhere else? I was like, well, we need a porthole. And then I started looking around, and CERN was in the news a lot at the time, and still is, really, because conspiracy nuts love CERN.
Oh yeah.
It's going to be the end of the world. It's supposed to have been the end of the world multiple times, but I was like, well, they do interesting stuff, and given my engineering background, I like what they kind of research, and I kind of use that as my setting as well. I need a special event that occurs in a physical location that I can do the research on and kind of get an understanding of and make it semi-plausible. So setting it in the real and now kind of let me make plausible extrapolations from things that currently existed, and I could kind of take those in certain directions. So once I had a location and a rough time, which was the near future, not exactly current day, but far enough in the future that a few advances have been happening, especially in certain technologies and weapons and military platforms, etc. With any book, I think you need to kind of get the reader to suspend disbelief. So the more outlandish the concept it is, and the more unrealistic it sounds, the more likely your reader is going to go, I don't really, the author had me, but he's lost me, because that's literally just not how things will ever work, or I don't expect them to ever work. And having it in the now, based on things that do exist or soon to exist, kind of lowered that bar, perhaps. So when I do take liberties, they're not as outlandish given the rest of the book that's occurring around it. And yeah, it's like, so I've got a whole bunch of Marines running around in exosuits, and these things are in active development and testing at the moment. I've got a few little kind of automated drone robots. I mean, if anybody's familiar with Boston Dynamics, the things that they do is kind of scary as well.
Yes, indeed,
so I've tried to ground it. Yeah, I've tried to ground Monstre in things that are real already. So when I throw in monstres, they don't seem too far-fetched, especially if you're then tying it to wormholes and parallel universes. Like the math says these things are there. And then, so what would happen if our worlds collided? And that's kind of what I try to write about.
I mentioned earlier, like that there's these two different time periods going on, and so I said this at the top, where I'm like, you have like the Marines having this sort of action adventure sci-fi thing in Europe, and then parallel to that, you've got like 89 days later and on is what's happening in America, where essentially the cloud, this thing that's been released after this disaster at CERN, is basically just been sort of consuming the world, and every place that it goes, just things go dark and disaster follows. America's been spared for this for about 89 days, and now it's crossing over and it's hitting these shores, and the response is that a lot of people are going crazy, a lot of people are fleeing, a lot of people are taking their own lives because they don't see any way
the future.
They see no future. They see no way of surviving it. And it paints a really grim vision of the world. From the standpoint of writing the story, I think you have kind of two different tones going on. You have sci-fi action happening, and then you're switching gears over to more of like survival horror in a way in America. And I like the idea of taking those two things and running them parallel, because it allows you to tell two different kinds of stories and overlap them. But that seems like a difficult chore from the standpoint of creating a narrative and figuring out how to balance it and pace it and make that work. So what was your decision making behind that, and then what challenges did you run to creating that?
I started writing the US side first, and I'd kind of only intended on writing the US side. But then the more I wrote the US side, the more I realized it was just going to be a World War Z copy, or there's going to be The Walking Dead. Like the idea has been done kind of, and I still need to kind of explain, at least in my mind, I needed to explain and reveal a bit more of the threat to justify why things are going so crazy in the US. And then I started trying to parallel the two stories, which in hindsight for a debut, I don't know if I would do it again or ever advise somebody else to do it. Because it really complicated things. It was like every day was like trying to solve that high school maths problem. If you've got train A leaving station and train B leaving a station, and they're traveling at X and Y miles an hour, when do they meet? And it was very much trying to play off the two storylines so that I knew when they would meet at the right time. So it was kind of a case of, as I kept writing, I'd have to add a little bit of track over here, so the stories intersected where I wanted them to. Yeah, not an easy mental exercise. Not very efficient, perhaps. I mean, because I tend to write from the pants more than the plot, I ended up having to just cut quite a significant amount of some instances where the scenes are just unnecessary, deviated from the story. So complicated is probably the best way of saying how that process was. For the next book, I don't think I'm going to have two parallel storylines running. It might be a bit tricky, but having them separate has, I think, at the end of the day, helped really balance the different paces that I've tried to evoke in both. So the US side is more of a slow burn that builds and builds and builds, whereas the France side is more just like a car chase that just never stops. And then
Yeah,
at some point, there's going to be a head-on collision, and that's why I've been building. I've always been building to this head-on collision that I know is coming. And having the two storylines as a side effect has allowed me to kind of give the reader a break when it gets a bit too intense in one storyline. I can jump across to the other. It's enabled me to do these lovely little cliffhangers that annoy the reader, but keep them coming back for more, where I put the situation, I'll put a character in a situation, and we leave them in the dark. We then jump back to the next perspective or the other storyline, and then people kind of, while that storyline is progressing, is wondering what's happening to the characters in the other storyline. So it was an accidental narrative device, an overly complicated one, but I don't think MONSTRE would have worked without it.
I mean, and I think that's as good as an argument as you need for it, is that if it needs it to work, then it's what it needs.
Yeah.
That's what the story needed.
Yeah.
You have a lot of POVs in this novel.
I do.
And in kind of classic horror, survival horror type storytelling, not all these people make it out alive. Some of them don't make it very long in the novel. So we spend some time with characters who maybe don't have a pretty short shelf life in this story. When you're writing a story like that, where, you know, there is no guaranteed through line for any one of these characters, how do you balance the amount of time that you give to each individual character, getting the audience invested in them before they might meet their untimely end? How much of that works towards creating a sense of unpredictability in the storyline? And how careful do you have to dance on the line to make sure you don't alienate an audience for getting them invested and then killing somebody off?
I read somewhere that basically the first line of a book is basically a promise to the reader. Like, you know, the first opening paragraph is the promise of the rest of the book. And I thought, okay, well, how about the first character be my promise? And my first character is this guy called Reese. And generally speaking, in most books, the first character you get introduced to is kind of tends to be the one you follow for the most of the story, or at least is a significant part. And Reese doesn't make it very far. So I very much wanted the reader to kind of be surprised that they'd been following a character who they were kind of getting to know and learn about, and then the guy gets eaten alive. I also couldn't see another way of doing a book, especially an end-of-the-world story, where you don't have death. And you don't want all of your characters running around with plot armor.
Right.
If they're constantly getting out of impossible situations, then what use is any kind of threat in it? So, and I think that any kind of believable threat have to be consequences. And the intent of having so many points of view is kind of to show that not everybody is safe. No one has plot armor, and that you need to be incredibly lucky or determined to survive. And even then, I wanted to show that no matter what some characters did, they still die at the end. And it kind of, you know, there's no avoiding their fate, which is pretty much how I view the world. I mean, the real world is a dark, ugly place, and terrible things happen to good people every day. And I kind of wanted a book that brought that in as part of its underlying tone. So, you know, in the same breath, I do have a component of core characters that kind of tend to survive through most of the book, and you get introduced to them as they pop up and others die. But the idea was to at least have the reader guess, or try understand or guess who was going to survive and if they could survive. And with having that many different characters as well, it opens the door to people trying to determine what would they do in a similar situation. If they were faced with that, would they take the easy way out? Would they fight? And I don't think you can do that without a high body count, especially in an end of the world book. So just as I think MONSTRE needed two storylines, I had to have a high body count.
I mean, I think it's also, I mean, when you think about intended audience for a book, different genres have different expectations. I think if you've got people who are in sci-fi horror or like military sci-fi, they expect body counts. That's, I mean, that audience is going to be like, yeah, that's par for course. You need, there's a certain level of attrition that's going to have to happen for it to feel real, like it has stakes, like it has consequences, versus somebody who might read more like, you know, if they came in from either maybe YA or they came in from something like space opera or magical realism or something, they're going to experience a very different kind of feel and vibes. And that's an interesting thing when you go to Goodreads, and how often you'll find people who got a copy of something that was out of genre for where their normal tastes lie. And oftentimes the response is, well, I don't normally read this kind of thing, but I got into this. And that's always interesting to me. I'm like, I read across like all kinds of stuff. So I don't, you know, I'm used to that kind of genre hopping, but certain people stay in their lane. And so when they get something that's outside of that, it can definitely be kind of a surprise for them. So I think, that's always worth considering with stuff like this. Every book is informed by the the choices that a writer makes. You reach tough decision points, and whether there are things that you discover while you're plotting or while you're a discovery writer like you were talking about, or working with your editors or your writers group, things you have to fix and things you need to evolve to make a story work. We've talked about a few of those things for you, but is there a point in the novel, without being spoilery, where you got faced with something that was a significant, difficult choice and that you had to kind of figure out a way to fix, and that maybe that had a big impact on what the book became?
I've already touched on this, but I think I've touched on one of these. There were two big kind of deal breakers almost, where I've got two editors in my corner, and I started with one editor and then came to the next editor just because it had been like, I think 4 years of working with one, and I wanted somebody to proofread it with fresh eyes after the story had gone through quite a few iterations. But basically my first editor said to me that the dual storylines, the dual timelines was a bit jarring in some instances. Like, there were two different stories, didn't quite work. Perhaps I should separate it out. But at the time, I think only a quarter of Monstre had been written. So we're very early in the process. And it was kind of like, no, I had a grand vision in my head, and I thought it was the only way that I could get it to work. So it's probably, I could count on one hand the times I've disagreed with editors and stuck to my guns. And that would be one of them. I was like, no, it doesn't work otherwise. At least I can't see a way of making it work. So that was the biggest sticking point, is do I split the book and have two books, one about France, one about the US? What was the other? The other, funnily enough, came much later when Monstre was basically finished, and we started trying to work out how to sell the thing. And that's when we started talking to publicists, and our publicist, Smith Publicity, suggested we split the book into 2 volumes, which is why there's a volume 1 and a volume 2. We took that advice, but that was a tough one, because originally Monstre was one big fat 1,000-page book. But their advice was, it's going to be hard to, as a debut author, garner enough interest of reviewers to take on an 1,000-page book from an unknown. Like, people's time is precious, especially reviewers. They have a to be read list probably as large as your bookshelf behind you. Mm-hmm. Getting in that queue with a book from somebody who has no following, no past publishing credentials to fall back on was going to be a hard sell. So we split the book at a kind of a point that seemed logical, which left 2 cliffhangers, which have annoyed readers, but also garnered a lot of interest. So I know that people are coming back for the second volume. And that's also one of those things where I deferred to better judgment than my own. And it's worked out pretty well so far. But those are the 2 kind of keep me up at night for a few day kind of questions that couldn't easily resolve. Those are the 2 big kind of deal breakers, game changers, I should say.
People who've watched or listened to this show for a long time will know that I often talk about the fact that I typically steer away from doorstopper, massive volume books, and I'm a big fan of novellas and shorter runs. I like tighter stories. See,
I'm the opposite.
Yeah, and
I like a big fat book.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing to kind of find how readers are like that. And I was like that when I was younger. And epic fantasy and then people who like Stephen King and stuff like that do tend to like these 120,000 word, really big volumes. Somewhere along the lines, my own attention span started to fracture, and part of that's I'm ADHD and I have a lot of things going on all the time. So I sometimes struggle to stay involved in a book that's that long. So when something comes across my bow where it's like, oh, here's something that's a good, clean 450 pages, I'm like, there it is. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I want. Like you said, I think it's tough for a new reader or a new author to come in and say, hey, look, here's 1,000 pages. And for an audience to be like, well, I don't know who this person is, and I don't know if I want to pick up a book that large and invest that amount of time and then, have the potential of giving up on it early or something. I appreciate that option, that decision, to make that split. I know cliffhangers do freak people out, and it is worth noting that is, how this book ends. But, but like you said, you already knew where you were going with the rest of it. So, so that's a helpful thing to know as well.
The cliffhanger that we ended on is probably an even better ending than I could have had if it had just been a single 500-page book anyway. Like it leaves a really ugly unanswered question that people really need catharsis to and some closure to. To be sneaky, it means people come back for volume 2. So it was a weird business decision, more than a writing decision, but I think it's the right one. But I think, leading back to your, Stephen King kind of example, you tend to find your big fat books from authors who do a lot of world building, and that's far more often your sci-fi, fantasy kind of thing, where you need to explain a magic system, or you need to explain a whole new continent that doesn't exist. Like that chews up words. So the more different the book is from your standard real world that everybody's familiar with, I think just the longer it gets.
Yeah, for sure. World building has a big impact on that. You mentioned earlier that you are kind of a discovery writer, a pantser. And do you have any kind of plotting system that you use at all? Whether, I mean, whether it's just as simple as a 3-act structure or some other kind of structure you're looking at? Like, what were you using developing this?
The small disclaimer, I mean, you sent that question to me earlier, and I had never heard of those terms before, to be honest. Save the cat, 7-point structure, 3/4 act, hadn't heard of them. Process-wise, I have tried to brainstorm, plot, structure my books out according to some kind of timeline using big 2 sheets of paper. But as I've discovered, as soon as I kind of start writing, it deviates very quickly from that. And I think in part because I'm a pantser, but I'm also, I tend to write in terms of problems and then solving said problems. And when I'm plotting this big overarching viewpoint, I don't actually have a good grasp on all the problems my character is going to encounter along the way. It could be something as simple as how did they get from A to B? And you don't really think of that when you're plotting, etc. And as I've kind of gone through the writing process, I've had to solve these problems as I encounter them, which means whatever plan I had, I deviate very quickly from it. I would like to be more structured going forward. I think it'd be a great idea to have a plan. It's something I definitely want to work on. I'm going to have to obviously go Google Save the Cat because it sounds interesting. I know where I'm going is my easiest answer. I know where I want to get to. I kind of pick a starting point, and then I try to solve the problems I encounter along the way to get to my defined ending point. And it's very much like I write and then see what sticks. And then if anything kind of is excess, I just cut it, which has also helped, apparently, make the story nice and concise and keep the pace going throughout. So, yeah, I think for the next book, I would definitely try plot a bit more. But for this MONSTRE one, it is kind of a discovery. So I think Stephen King writes the same way. What does he call it? Unearthing a fossil, I think. Mm-hmm. He starts digging and the story reveals itself as he goes along. And I think that's probably been the closest analogy to how I write. I know there's a fossil down there and I kind of maybe have a rough idea, but I don't know where the bones are located until I start digging.
And then also, just to finish up here, then, what are your tools of the trade? So, what kind of software are you writing in?
Scrivener. Scrivener has been a lifesaver. I can't remember what I started writing, and I tried a few programs when I first started out, and then Scrivener, I just really like the functionality. There's a chalkboard thing you can use, which I don't, but I very much like the folder, drag and drop, rearrangement style, the structure you can have. Like you can have multiple tiers, and it worked really well for me in terms of how I kept doing the time shifts. So I could really organize my scenes so my scenes are also structured by character or character name, and it let me at least lay it out in a really nice visual way that my brain likes. So yeah, Scrivener for the win. And then for editing, just Word. I mean, track changes is pure magic when you're working with an editor, that you have a good record of what they've changed and the suggestions, and you can write notes. So yeah, between Scrivener and Word, I don't think you need much more. And Scrivener, I think, is like when I bought it, $60. I don't know if it's still that, but worthy investment.
Absolutely. We mentioned at the top that you're, fairly new into the social media space as you've, started your author journey. Where should people be following you to learn more about your stories, about when the next volume is coming, all of that stuff?
I'm going to plug my website because I think that's worth a look for most people because it has all the art and kind of all the links in the story. But www.duncanswan.me is the website, and then at the top it's got all my links to my social. And I'm on Twitter. I'm on Pinterest, I'm on the gram, a little bit on Facebook, but it's more like the author page that gets populated from the posts from the other two platforms. And yeah, like we're slowly growing. But yeah, I think the website is basically where most of my content, and in the next week or so, I'm hoping to have an updates page as well, just to get keep people abreast of Volume 2 and the timeline and the artists that I've worked with and the upcoming art that I'm hoping to work with, and then place for the reviews to kind of live. Because the problem with all Twitter and the gram is that it refreshes so quickly.
Yeah, it gets lost.
Your content gets buried, and there's no archive and no easy place for people to find out. And I think that's where an author's website is worth its absolute weight in gold if it's done well. And we took time to make ours appealing and aesthetic as possible. So
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of that. I talk about that all on the show where like I think authors need to focus on the fact that they have a press kit, that they have current materials.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily need to spend a whole lot of time blogging or any of that stuff, but they need to have the stuff that when somebody comes looking that it's there, you know, they want to see the author's face. They want to know who they are. They want to know when the books are coming, or they want to know what's out and where they've been published. And all that stuff I think is really important from a marketing standpoint, but also just from a reader standpoint.
Yeah. And that's, I think that was also one of the differentiating things is that I tried the blogging thing a long time ago when I first started doing this. It was more like a declaration of intent. I think I had like 6 blog pieces on a separate website where I kind of pulled the plug in my old life and said, now I'm writing. But as I discovered, I'm not a blogger. To my own mind, I sound too narcissistic. So I was like, no, I'm not going to do that kind of stuff. I've only got so much content to write about. And at the time, wasn't very much of a subject matter expert on any of the things that we've now done. But yeah, for some other people, it works great. It's a great way for them to engage with their audience, whereas I very much try to just focus on writing books, and then the website is very much where all the other content will live. That's where our art will live, and hopefully graphic novel links will live in the future. And if I get an animated short done, that's where that's going to live. And that's kind of where I'll focus our website attention on.
I think that's an excellent plan. So like I said at the top, MONSTRE Volume 1 is available now. It's on Amazon. It's on Bookshop. I think it's actually on Kindle Unlimited. So if
it's on Kindle Unlimited, yep.
Yeah. So if that's your jam on Amazon, then definitely go that route as well. And then, I mean, I think this is going to scratch the itch for people who like a gritty sci-fi story, who like that survival horror, that like things that, you know, blend and cross over genres. I think this is an exciting thing to check out, and especially to, you know, find a book that has gone a different route than some of the traditional publishing. And I mean, I think, you know, self-publishing and indie publishing is developing in a rapid, crazy pace. It's definitely an avenue that's for a very successful a lot of authors, but it's also the Wild West. It's a new place to kind of figure out how things work without gatekeepers and changing the game. And I think clearly you're sort of mapping a different path in that way, which I think is very cool. So, Duncan, thank you so much for getting on here and talking with it. And best of luck as this thing rolls out and as the next volume comes out.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been great chatting to you.